guess while we're waiting, I'll introduce myself and start the welcome process. My name's Steve Riley, and I'm Assistant Coordinator for the Northern Great Plains Joint Venture. And I'm going to be kind of the MC of the meeting today. So I'll pop in and out here and there and try to keep things rolling. We do have we had a list of that was open to 40 people to join. I think we picked up 42 in the end to make sure we had the rooms filled when we get to breakout sessions. But just want to welcome everyone this morning to the grazing planning for wildlife workshop. And as you read when you were probably signing up for the workshop, the idea here is that not all wildlife folks really get very exposed to the notion of working with private landowners, and even fewer really have a tight grasp on what it's like to talk to them about grazing. And at the same time, when we're working in grassland ecosystems, if we're going to affect wildlife populations, a lot of times how the grass is being eaten makes a big difference. And so being able to sit down and take a morning to talk about how to go about developing what goes into developing a grazing plan, and how to have a conversation with producers about it, how to work with colleagues to kind of bridge some of the gaps that you might have, we felt like is a pretty important thing to discuss. And so, and it's no better place to do it than with the Wildlife Society. So again, welcome everyone this morning. And one thing I would ask is that you be mindful of your microphones, so we don't end up with a lot of traffic. We'll hopefully have about 50 people on the call when we are fully formed here. And I'll try to keep us moving. It'd be nice to have your cameras on so that folks can see your smiling faces this morning, and we can make it more like a real workshop, as much as COVID wants to take that away from us. And with that, I'm gonna just jump right in. We don't have a lot of extra time. To start us off this morning, Catherine Whiteman, the coordinator of the Northern Great Plains Joint Venture, is going to kind of get us set in the right mindset. So I'll turn it over to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. It's good to see some familiar faces and names. And for those of you I haven't met yet, I'm Catherine Whiteman. I work as the coordinator of the Northern Great Plains Joint Venture, and I previously worked for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So that's why I see a lot of old friends here today. I wanted to start with just thank you all for making the time today to have this conversation, and really wanted to thank the planning team and all the speakers and the breakout facilitators and all the folks that have pulled together to make this workshop happen. We have a couple of landowner representatives that are making some time later today to just provide some firsthand experience. So want to thank them, although I don't believe they are on quite yet. And then I especially want to thank Steve for all the hard work. Steve's the one that visioned of this workshop and has done all the behind the scenes heavy lifting. So big shout out and thanks to Steve for all his work on that. So why are we here? Steve asked me to just talk about that really briefly. And so as wildlife professionals, in part, what we do is work to build and support sustainable and resilient lands for wildlife. And but when we talk about resilient rangelands, we often do so in the context of working lands. And so this workshop is designed to help us as professionals understand the complexities of grazing management and how we can work with producers to help provide wildlife habitat while also helping them meet their objectives for livestock production. So there is a lot of expertise in this workshop today. There's many people here that know way more about this topic than I do, for sure. And many of you, especially those of you that have been working in the field for a while, know that not all grazing practices are going to benefit wildlife. And so there is a conversation to have with producers if we want to achieve these dual objectives of wildlife habitat and helping them meet their livestock objectives. So by continuing to build our education and improve upon our knowledge, we can become more competent and more confident in making recommendations when talking with producers. And for some of the folks that may be newer to this conversation, this will also be a good primer to help you understand when there's times when asking for outside expertise is really the best way to help solve a complicated land management project or something that you're working on with a landowner. And by doing so, by asking for help and by being competent, you can really build a lot more trust and respect with the individual landowners, which will lead to more productive partnerships. So today we're hoping that the information and discussions in the workshop will help everybody understand the challenges and decisions faced by ranchers, and that will allow us to work together more effectively to identify solutions that are going to work for both the ranchers and for wildlife habitat. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Steve, and look forward to the discussions today.
Yeah, thanks for that, Catherine. So, Cami, are you ready to jump right into your presentation?
Yes.
All right. Well, I want to introduce Cami Kilwine with the Natural Resource Conservation Service. Cami is one of the rangeland conservationists, and so this will be an opportunity for those of you who maybe haven't worked with NRCS to kind of get an understanding that NRCS has specialists in various different disciplines spread around the state, and Cami is one of the rangeland specialists. So if you get into working with ranchers in the future, you may want to remember how to get a hold of a rangeland specialist. So Cami's going to talk to us this morning about building a grazing plan. So we're not going to waste any time this morning. If you haven't had your coffee, we're gonna tighten the belts up and jump right into it. So Cami, if you can go ahead and share your screen and get us going, that'd be great.
Thanks, Steve. Actually, when I hit the share screen button, it says sharing screen has been disabled.
Oh boy. Well, first glitch of the Zoom
Off to a good start.
meeting. I'll get it.
Try one more time. I just changed it to all participants. Try it one more time.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. I think we're good to go.
Thanks, Carol.
Okay. So let me see if I can move this around a little bit. Like Steve said, my name's Cami Kilwine. I'm the area range specialist out of Miles City. I basically write grazing plans for a living. So today I'm going to do a quick overview of the processes that I take and some of the things I think about when writing a grazing plan, especially with wildlife goals in mind. So if your goal is to work with the landowner to improve habitat on an operation, and in most all cases, you should have an idea of what their habitat looks like, what habitat elements are missing or need improvement, and what is already in good shape that you can build upon. An inventory will give you a chance to develop more specific goals. Essentially, the better that you know a property, the ins and outs of the livestock operation, the more trust the producer will have in your opinion. So often we deal with multi-layered goals, as this example shows. Other times the goals are going to be more simple. The goals of the operation or the project you were working on will certainly impact what sort of inventory data you may need. And hopefully upon implementation of the plan, you can use the inventory data you collected as benchmark conditions for monitoring your success. So what is an inventory? The easiest answer is it is whatever it needs to be. Always begin with the end in mind. Don't collect data just to collect data. Collect the data you need to answer the questions you have. Most inventories start with a drive-through of the place. For some, that is all that is needed. But if you're working with a producer on developing improved grazing strategies, often we need a lot more information. We generally collect information on the amount of forage that is available per pasture. We get an idea of what plant communities are on the place, how they are distributed, how they compare to the potential or desired plant communities that we're looking for. We generally map out existing stock tanks, fences, reservoirs, power lines, sage-grouse leks, you name it. Inventories give us a chance to identify resource concerns and start thinking about alternatives that we can use as treatments to create the habitat that we want. You also need to have a good understanding of how the operation works, what kind of livestock they're running, how many head, what are their current management strategies. And in my experience, every ranch has bottlenecks in their grazing rotation that need to be considered to have a successful plan. So the first question to generally be answered is the operation properly stocked? If during your drive-through it doesn't appear to be, then you may need to invest more time to determine sound, defendable stocking rates. In those cases, I prefer fairly in-depth inventories that clip and weigh actual forages on the ground. But if the ranch appears to be in good shape and properly stocked, visual estimates of forage production, estimating forage production based on soil ecological site data, or just using the producer's own grazing records to come up with AUM estimates per pasture may be a better option. So some things to keep in mind. Not all plants are forage, not all acres are grazable. So an inventory should account for steep slopes or areas that are far from water that won't be grazed. Also keep in mind that treat acres generally have lower forage quality and often graze less than surrounding rangeland or meadows. So these factors can have considerable impact on the carrying capacity. Within NRCS, we generally give out 3 numbers. The benchmark AUMs, which is the amount of forage that they have now with their existing infrastructure and current management. Planned AUMs, which is what we think they will have after they implement the project we are working on. And potential AUMs, which are the amount of forage that the property can produce if it was in higher condition. So generally, the planned AUMs and potential AUMs are good selling points for the grazing rotation that you're trying to pitch. Okay, so now for the dry part. In your breakout sessions, you will be asked to do some basic forage and livestock calculations. To prepare you for those, we're going to go through some of the definitions and then some equations themselves. First, because not all operations run the same class of livestock, conventional stock calculations are centered around an animal unit as a way of standardizing forage calculations. An animal unit is one mature cow of approximately 1,000 pounds with a calf as old as 6 months or its equivalent. That cow will eat approximately 30 pounds of dry weight forage per day. That is called an animal unit day, and 915 pounds of dry forage in a month. So AUDs and AUMs are representations of the amount of forage consumed. This table shows how different classes and species of livestock compare to that 1,000 pound cow with a calf. These are called animal unit equivalents. For example, a mature bull is equivalent to 1.5 times one mature 1,000 pound cow with a calf. There are animal unit equivalents for wildlife as well. So if you need to consider forage consumed by wildlife in your calculations, this tool will help you with that. And then lastly, AUMs per acre is generally known as stocking rate, and that's the amount of forage that each acre can produce. So here I'm going to try to explain how the conventional method for determining stocking rates works. Generally, we clip hoops or a series of hoops, and from that we can determine what the land is producing. In this example, it's producing 900 pounds of dry weight forage. Traditional knowledge automatically dedicates half of that forage production back to the plant. So in general, a plant produces twice as many leaves as it needs to survive, with the assumption that it's going to be grazed or lose some of its leaves in some fashion. Of the other half that can be dedicated as forage for livestock, we must consider how much of that forage is actually going to be ingested. This is called harvest efficiency. Harvest efficiency can vary and be improved upon. We will talk about that more later, but the traditional starting points are 25% for range and 35% for pasture. That means that of the half that can go to the grazing animals, we assume that only half, or 25% of the total, will actually get ingested. The other half may be lost to trampling, insects, hail, not used, whatever. So for the math, if we have 900 pounds of forage being produced per acre, and we're assuming that only 25% of that will actually be ingested, we take 900 pounds times 0.25 and then divide that by 1 AUM, which is 915 pounds, to get 0.25 AUMs per acre. So most grazing units in Montana have multiple different sites producing different amounts of forage. This is an example of an in-depth inventory and the calculations in the background used to determine the number of AUMs per pasture and across the ranch. Pounds per acre of forage were estimated on each ecological site, and different harvest efficiencies were assigned. So each area has an identified stocking rate. To determine total AUMs per pasture, we take the AUMs per acre for each site times the acres of that site, and then add all the AUMs up. So in this example, the top line shows the site has stocking rate of 0.33, and it's 25.3 acres large. So we take 0.33 times 25.3. That one site is producing 8.3 AUMs, and the pasture in total is producing about 260. So obviously this feels like a lot of work, but remember that not every inventory needs to be in depth and not every site needs to be clipped. Once people start clipping, it's fairly easy to train your eye to estimate forage production fairly quickly. But determining forage production is extremely important because proper stocking rates are the most consequential rangeland management factor. I've yet to see an overstocked operation be sustainable. Even if a producer is doing everything right, but is overstocked or certain fields are overgrazed, improvements in ecological health will be very hard to accomplish. Sometimes plants need multiple years to recover after severe grazing events. So if adequate recovery periods are not built into the grazing rotation, even the fanciest rotation may not meet its ecological goals. Whereas conservatively stocked operations that may not have much of an rotation at all, but are not overgrazing, may have fairly resilient and ecological sound systems on the ground. In those situations, range health is generally declining from underuse instead of overuse. Consider wildlife use and drought when thinking about carrying capacity. The most successful season systems I have seen either have flexible stocking, meaning that they are fluid. They buy and sell cattle based on known ecological or climatic triggers related to forage production, or every year they are stocked for a drought year. So here's the last set of calculations for a while. How many days can 100 pairs graze a field with 125 AUMs? First, we have to calculate how many animal units the herd is comprised of. So let's assume each mother cow in this herd is 1,200 pounds. Using the chart I showed earlier, that means her animal unit equivalent is 1.2. We take 100 pairs times 1.2. The herd is comprised of 120 animal units. So as you can see, bigger cattle make a big difference in the amount of forage consumed compared to the standard of a 1,000 pound cow with a calf. Next, divide the total AUMs by the total animal units to get the available months of grazing. So we're going to take 125 AUMs divided by 120 animal units to get 1.04 months. Lastly, to convert that to days, simply multiply it by 30.5 days. So in this example, this field has 32 days worth of grazing. Sticking with that herd of 100 pairs, let's calculate how many AUMs they need for a full grazing period of 8 months. So we know that the herd is comprised of 120 animal units. If you take animal units times months of grazing, you will get total AUMs needed. So in this case, 120 times 8 is 960 AUMs. Okay, so we're going to shift gears and dive into things that we keep in mind when writing our grazing plan. First and foremost, do not lose sight of what the goal of the grazing plans are. I'm going to go through basic ecological principles and plant responses to grazing. My goal is that you will have a better understanding of how to use those principles to provoke the change you want to see on the landscape. As I move through these principles, the focus on the remainder of the presentation will be how to use grazing to improve overall land health. Often, improving the overall health, function, and sustainability of a grazing unit is at least one of the goals of the project, but it's not always going to be. As biologists, once you know what kind of habitat you want to create, it's my hope that you can use these basic principles to determine how best to create that habitat. Okay, so first, you've all heard of take half, leave half. So let's briefly cover why this is the general rule of conventional grazing plants. As I mentioned earlier, most grasses produce twice as many leaves as they actually need. Because the plant purposely produces more leaves than it needs, studies have shown that removing 50% of the above ground biomass of the plant has moderate to no effect on root growth. Roots are always being lost in the soil. So when root growth stops, the root system actually shrinks, which impacts the plant's ability to regrow, recover, and survive. Once more than 50% of the above ground biomass has been removed, the higher the use level, the longer the recovery period will be. So from this chart, as you can see, at 60% utilization, half of all root growth is stopped. The plant does not have enough leaf area to support regrowth of leaves and roots, so the energy has to be distributed away from the root system. There is data on how long this effect lasts, but in reality, it depends on the growing conditions at the time. If growing conditions are good, at higher use levels, root growth may not start again for 2 weeks, but if growing conditions are poor, significant root mass can be lost and it may take multiple years for the plant to recover. And just like having too much bare ground, a lot can happen when you lose root biomass. There's a cascading effect. These are just some photos of what different utilization levels may look like, but keep in mind, utilization happens at the individual plant level, and often not all plants are used the same. When determining utilization, it is best to look at the use levels of the species you are managing for. When the majority of those plants are at your target utilization level, it's time to move the cattle. So we can't talk about utilization without talking about growing points. All the above ground growth takes place at growing points, which are at the nodes on the stem of the plant and at the base of the plant. If a leaf tip is bitten off, it does not regrow from the tip. Instead, the leaf continues to elongate from the base where the growing point is located. If growing points on the stem are removed, the plant has to initiate regrowth from the buds at the base of the plant. This would be shown on the bottom right picture. It's basically has to make new stems. Whereas if the plant is grazed above the height of the growing points, it can quickly resume grazing from that growing point. So shown on the top right in this picture. Plants with intact growing points on the stem can recover quicker than plants that have to put up new stems. And different types of plants place their growing points differently. Short grasses like blue grama are tolerant to heavy grazing because their buds are low on the plant and generally are not removed. The more productive decreaser species like blue bunch wheatgrass and green needlegrass have elevated growing points since they are generally taller statured species. So keep in mind that plants set buds and tillers in the fall. If those buds are removed by fall grazing or die over winter from trampling or freezing, the stand may lose 1/3 of its normal production the following spring. This is because instead of starting growth right away in the spring from the tillers and buds that were set the previous fall, the first couple of weeks of the spring will be dedicated to making new buds and tillers. This sets the plant's growth back significantly in the amount of forage that it can produce that year. So just because a plant is dormant does not mean that it cannot be hurt. On native rangeland, we like to see grazing periods less than 45 days. This allows the plant half the growing season to recover. It also limits the amount of regrazing of individual plants. It takes about 14 to 30 days for a plant to regrow back to a height that it can be grazed a second time. By keeping grazing periods less than 45 days, we can reduce regrazing, but it certainly does not eliminate it. Shorter grazing periods also mean that within a rotation, more changes in season use can be accomplished. I'll show you examples of this later. And then compared to season-long grazing, the higher stock density should have positive impacts on livestock distribution, which means the producer has more control over utilization. So when we talk about different rotations, you'll hear people suggest changing season of use. What they're essentially saying is don't use the same native range field at the same time year after year. Set rotations where the producer has a spring pasture, fall pasture, summer pasture, and so on generally have noticeable impacts on species composition, even if they're managing grazing durations and utilization well. Keep in mind, this is a general rule for native rangeland, not introduced pasture, which I'll talk about in a minute. So why is it a good idea to change season years? Grazing is most impactful to the plant during the boot pre-elongation stage, right before seed set. Since our rangelands are diverse, different species enter the boot stage at different times. In set rotations, certain species are being grazed at this critical period year after year. Those species often fade from the plant community as neighboring plants that are not in the boot stage are given a competitive advantage. So by changing season of use, you are spreading out that impact. And as you all know, we have cool and warm season plants. Cool season plants start growth in the spring, then often go dormant in the summer, whereas warm season plants start growth in the late spring and into early summer. The chart on this slide shows a generalized growth curve for cool and warm season plants, but keep in mind that within these groups, the growth curves for individual species varies. Livestock will target cool season plants when they are actively growing in April, May, and June. Then they will shift their focus to warm season grasses and forbs. But as always, it's more complicated than that. A lot of our warm season plants are actually most palatable after a hard frost. But in general, pastures grazed in the spring will have a lot of warm seasons, and summer grazed pastures will have more cool seasons due to preferential use. So if you want to manage for or against a specific species, use season of use to your advantage. So oftentimes in eastern Montana, we'll see this scenario where the warm and cool season plants are in different locations within a pasture. Little bluestem may be growing on the hillsides, and cool season dominated communities may be growing on the flats and the overflow sites. It can be extremely hard to manage the field as a whole for improved rangeland health if areas of preferential use are occurring. Fields like these are often overgrazed with a mosaic of completely ungrazed patches. Consequently, both plant community health are often declining in health. The cool season plant communities start to shift to short grass species, and the little bluestem patches get overgrown. Individual plants begin to shade themselves out and lose productivity, like the plant shown on the right. In this picture, this is actually one plant, and you can see the center of it has died out because there's too many years of growth in there that have shaded out the buds and tillers in that plant. So changing season of use can help shift distribution patterns from year to year, helping to keep the warm season plants from getting wolfy and unpalatable, and giving the cool season plants time for recovery. So this is what changing season of use may look like in a grazing rotation. There's 3 different years here. Year 1 is in yellow, year 2 is in blue, and year 3 is in red. This is a deferred rotation where the producers started in a different field each of the 3 years. Spring grazed fields were deferred the next year, and over the 3 years, most fields were used spring, summer, and fall. But since most ranches are not always laid out in a convenient fashion, it's often hard to change season of use significantly in all fields. So in this example, the bottom 2, 18A and 18B, were really far from the farmstead, really far from the calving pastures. So they, as a consequence, didn't get very much spring use over the length of the rotation. Okay, so let's talk about introduced grasses for a minute. Introduced forages were developed for specific uses. Each species has what is called an optimal use period, which is a period of time when that species is most palatable and most nutritious. So as you guys know, crested wheatgrass is best used in the early spring. It's common in calving pastures. And by mid-June most years, crested has set seed, become fibrous, loses protein content, and is no longer palatable. In general, pastureland is comprised of single or a small number of species. So grazing can be planned around these optimal use periods. These fields can be used at the same time year after year if proper utilization is applied and recovery periods are built into the grazing sequence. So to simplify pasture management, these 2 bullet points were developed. If you graze a field prior to the 4-leaf stage, leave that pasture with at least half of the growing season, so that the plants have some in-season recovery. If it is grazed after the 4-leaf stage, use utilization to determine when to move the cattle. So this chart kind of goes through when the 4-leaf stage may be accomplished. Another word for it is grazing readiness. As you can see, crested wheatgrass is ready for use when it's 4 to 6 inches tall, which generally is accomplished by April 20th, where pubescent wheatgrass does better with a longer deferment in the spring. Keeping growing points and maintaining enough above ground biomass for introduced forages is also important. Because we're dealing with single species or not as many species compared to native range, we can simplify the process of determining utilization, generally through these standardized stubble heights. So not all the species listed here are introduced, but you can see species like intermediate wheatgrass require more stubble to maintain their growing points and above ground biomass as compared to something like crested wheatgrass. All right, so we're going to jump into grazing rotations really quick. I wanted to show this slide to remind us that grazing rotations should be built with the goals of the operation in mind. Cookie cutter grazing rotations rarely work, or at least do not provide the full potential effect as a customized grazing rotation will. Grazing rotations can be as simple or as complex, adaptive, and intentional as the goals and objectives of the operation require. I always make my producers write their own grazing plans. They will always know their operation better than I will. It is my job to teach them the ecological principles and offer grazing strategies that will help them meet their goals. It is their job to figure out what that grazing strategy will ultimately look like for them. Over the years, I have learned that every grazing system is and should be different. Not only is everyone different, but over time, every grazing plan seems to change. So having a grazing plan is important, but knowing the ecological consequences of grazing management decisions is far more important. The best land managers I know are adaptive. They are reacting in real time to their observations that they are seeing on the ground. Okay, so earlier I mentioned that grazing rotations can be used to increase harvest efficiency. I'm not going to go through all the calculations on this slide, but I do want to make the point that increasing harvest efficiency means that the producer can get more AUMs out of the grazing unit. If the producer increases their harvest efficiency but does not increase their number of livestock, the additional AUMs may allow him or her to leave one or more pastures ungrazed and completely rested. So let's look at this. In the first scenario, with a 25% harvest efficiency, the producer is able to harvest 136 AUMs. If each field is split in half and the efficiency increases to 30%, the producer is now able to harvest 165 AUMs. The fields are split in half one more time to where the producer has really good control over utilization and great distribution of grazing. They may be able to harvest 190 AUMs. These calculations do not include the potential increases in AUMs from improved rangeland health. They are just concentrating cattle enough that more of the half that can be dedicated to the cow actually gets consumed by cattle. More fields means that there's more flexibility in management. So don't get hung up on the wagon wheel design here. I just want to show how having more fields gives you benefits to grazing management. So under season-long grazing, often we see under and over grazing within a pasture. The producer will have very little control over utilization of the key species since cattle have free rein to be selective eaters. Patch grazing is common as individual plants are regrazed several times and other plants are not grazed at all. There is no recovery built into the system and there's no flexibility. Once the grass is gone, it is gone. Additional fields will give the producer better control over utilization, more flexibility in management decision. Each field will have a longer recovery period and there will be less regrazing of individual plants. Rest can then be incorporated, potentially without having to reduce the number of livestock. And if the rotation is a once-over type rotation, the regrowth that happens after grazing will be available for wildlife. So think nesting and winter habitat. When infrastructure is in place, management opportunities increase. The producer will have flexibility to be adaptive, to use observation to guide their management decisions. Even if their goal is to improve overall grazing health in all their fields, the producer will be able to incorporate specific prescriptions like rest or targeted grazing strategies into their management. They could also create desired habitat structure in specific fields. For example, if they could choose to graze one field hard to create a habitat for grassland bird species that like very little vegetative structure, or graze another at a low stock density to create the patchy structure. Okay, so now I'm going to go through the basic types of rotations. We've touched on the deferred system already. This is an example of it. In a deferred system, the producer alternates where they start grazing each spring. The fields that are grazed in the spring are then deferred the next year for later season use. In this example, this ranch only had 2 fields that they felt like they could start in the spring. Those are fields 7 and 3. And they just alternate year to year on that. So this rotation is only a 2-year rotation. And you can see by only having a 2-year rotation, a lot of the fields don't get a wide swing in season of use compared to the example I showed earlier. To implement deferred grazing systems without having to add a lot of fences, we often talk to people about combining multiple herds into 1 or 2 herds. Oftentimes people want to breed at a minimum their heifers in their own herd. So that's something that we talk about. Instead of keeping the heifers separate and then their own herd the entire year, just keep them separate during the breeding season, then move them back in with the older cows. The more cattle that are in a herd, the less grazing days they will spend in each pasture. So the more that can be done with a rotation. A rest rotation, I'm sure you guys are familiar with this. 1 or several fields are set aside to be rested for an entire year. The rested fields can be used for grazing as part of a contingency plan if there's drought or some other event that reduces forage availability. Generally, the spring grazed fields are rested the following year. The remainder of the fields are used in a rotation. Over the duration of the rotation, most all the fields get changes in season of use, rest, and deferment. In this example, field 1 is used the first year, and then rested the second year, and field 5 is used first. I only have 3 years listed in this rotation, but as you can imagine, if every field could be started in, this could be a 6-year rotation. Again, combine herds whenever possible to reduce grazing days per pasture. As you can see in this example, most of the fields are being used for a month and a half. If there were twice as many fields, larger changes in season of use could be accomplished, more recovery could be allocated, and more than 1 field could be rested per year. When you're developing rest rotation systems, pay attention to pasture size. It's very hard to implement a rest rotation on ranches with pastures that have really long grazing periods or in fields that aren't equal in AUMs. The adaptive version of a rest rotation would be where the producer would decide which field gets rested based on current observations instead of automatically assigning rest to the field that was grazed in the spring the prior year. Twice over systems were developed around the concept of tillering. So if a plant is grazed before the 4-leaf stage, that plant will respond by producing more tillers or stems. The plant is essentially recognizing that it may lose growing points on the stems it has already created. So to make up for that probability, it starts to dedicate energy into new stems. If the growing points of the original stems are not removed and new tillers are initiated, those plants will produce more forage than plants that were not stimulated by early season grazing. To capitalize on the tiller response, the goal of a twice-over system is to move quickly through a set of pastures prior to the 4-leaf stage, then come back later after a set recovery period to use the remainder of the AUMs. This System should only be done by managers that understand the ecological concepts behind it, because if it's done incorrectly, it can be very detrimental to plant productivity. It is best implemented on low diversity forages where there is exceptionally good control over grazing utilization and pastures that have good distribution. So oftentimes, grazing plans end up being a combination of different strategies. In this example, the ranch grazes pubescent wheatgrass, which is shown in green, in a twice over system in the spring. And they move through quickly the first time and then a slower move the second time through. The rangeland shown in white is deferred, with 15% of the AUMs being planned for rest each year. In the fall, cattle move to introduce forages that are good fall grazing and are rotated through those pastures. Okay, so some final thoughts. High condition rangeland is not well distributed across the landscape, so deferred and rest rotation systems that improve overall rangeland health are good starting points. I think once you get those implemented, then you can start implementing wildlife specific treatments if they're needed. Focus on ecological principles and not definite set in stone grazing rotations. To be successful, a grazing plan should be written by the producer. Grazing plans need to be flexible. The best rotations are adaptive and are based on current on-the-ground observations. So as I've said many times, combined herds, it just makes rating a good grazing plan so much easier, but you need to make sure that the water systems that the producer has can support the increases in herd size. Monitor results and adjust as needed. If you're dealing with improving riparian health or trying to get deciduous woody regeneration, consider winter use or short periods of spring use. In the summertime, they will congregate in the riparian areas and avoid the uplands if the riparian areas are greens and the uplands are dormant. And in the fall, the uplands are dormant and the deciduous saplings still have leaves. They will go after those young trees. In eastern Montana, we have woody draws that we often try to manage for. So in those, the more open the canopy, the harder it will be to recover the draw. So your goal is to get the canopy to close in with shrubs that will protect the saplings of the deciduous trees. Long rests, and by that I mean like you could do targeted rests of like 5 years, or maybe a rest rotation that actually gives multiple growing season deferment within it. Spring grazing and light winter grazing might be considered too. So consider offsite water and shelter. I know a lot of people over here will directionally fall trees in the draws to prevent cattle from walking up and down them. You guys talk a lot about in-pasture structural diversity for grassland birds. That's generally best created through longer grazing periods and selective grazing. So if you prescribe that long-term, it can be detrimental to rangeland health and ecological function. So before you're prescribing that, make sure that it's actually needed. Obviously, a lot of the rangeland in eastern Montana and western Montana too already has a lot of diversity just because our soils are not, the same across the landscape. So you might have a hard pan right next to a deep loam. That in itself creates structural diversity. So to create that, you can plan heavy use in one pasture and make sure you have enough recovery after it, or you can plan lighter use or patch grazing, and I kind of mentioned that earlier. Management intensive systems, so that would be like the systems you see that are mob grazing. If you get into a situation like that, you can use the complete control over livestock distribution, utilization, and timing to your advantage to create the habitat you want. As long as they aren't overgrazing, the in-season regrowth should be substantial. If you're trying to create winter and nesting habitat, you need residual cover from the previous growing season. So focus on proper stocking rates and utilization. Keep your grazing days short so there is a lot of regrowth. And essentially any rotation that has a lot of built-in in-season recovery should provide good residual cover. So I crammed a lot into hopefully what was a half an hour. And that's all I've got.
Thanks, Cami. You may want to unshare your screen and I'll open it up. That's as Cami said, that's an awful lot crammed into a half an hour. I'm guessing there are some questions, maybe some other thoughts that people have that might be good to add here, but let's start with questions for Cami. Tabitha says, I feel like I just took a whole grazing management course. And that's kind of what this is meant to be, is give you exposure to the whole thing and get a sense of what goes into all of this. Any questions?
Rick Northrup here. I got a question. Sorry, I turned my video off. So I'm curious if Cami can relay, typically, what are most, if she can generalize, what are ranchers mostly after when they work with NRCS on a grazing system? Is there something that's most common?
Yeah, I'd say improving their just overall rangeland health is the most common goal. They want to get better use out of the grass they have and create, more functional systems that produce more forage. And honestly, almost everyone that I work with does have wildlife goals that they're trying to accomplish. And recently, we've had a lot of people interested in improving riparian areas, woody draws, and more specific types like that on their places.
So kind of follow up then. So when they ask for that kind of help, are they coming from a place where they've kind of followed a tradition over generations of moving cattle into each pasture through time?
I think it just varies. Every ranch is so different. That is the case a lot of times. Other times they just know that they're not meeting the goals that they want to meet, and they want to figure out how to do better. And a lot of times, to be honest, they don't have the fence and water to accomplish the goals that they need. So obviously we help a lot with that too.
So Cami, one of the questions that came up in the chat was if you would be willing to make your PowerPoint available to the participants so they can have something to review later on.
Yep, I can definitely do that.
Yeah, if you send that,
to you.
yeah, that'd be great. I'll make it available. Other questions? Tabitha, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I have a question. Aaron's hand was up before me though. Do you need to? Okay,
Nope.
it's a leftover. Okay. Yeah, I've just been thinking about this mostly in terms of pollinators and sort of the forb component. And I just don't know how much that's even covered or thought about, but I guess, do you have any comments just generally about that?
Yeah. When you look at our ecological site potentials, the pollinator plants that represent early, mid, and late bloom periods are best represented at like high range condition plant communities. So, at those you're going to have stuff like the scurf peas and the blanket flowers and just a wider range of the perennial, like bigger statured forbs, as compared to something that's in degraded range health. You're going to have flushes of forbs, more annuals, and your bloom periods aren't going to be covered as well. So if that's the goal, I would shoot for grazing systems that improve range health.
Overall.
Yep, overall range health, yep.
Aaron.
Yeah, Cami, you talked early on about when you're deciding whether or not grazing management advice is warranted, and I think it's just, you're a pro at this, so it's easy for you to tell like whether it's properly stocked. It sounded like you were saying something along the lines of like doing that drive, like you said, and kind of doing that visual assessment to decide whether it's properly stocked. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you kind of make that assessment, early on.
Yeah, I mean, it's mostly looking at utilization levels as you cross ranch, but it's also looking at the plant communities that are there. If you have a good idea of what species should be there, and generally even just the size of the species that should be there. If you're driving across a place and it's all short grass dominated, blue grama, buffalo grass, prairie June grass, and it looks like it's being hit pretty hard, then they may have a stocking issue. But if you're seeing a lot of grass and you're seeing a lot of taller statured species, then they may be stocked properly, just need help with the rotation to keep things going in the right direction. Another big indicator to look for would be the percent of bare ground. And we have areas that naturally have a lot of bare ground, but outside of those areas, if you're seeing a lot of bare ground, that's probably a sign that something's not going right.
And I would just add to that it really depends on the system. That's not applicable everywhere. Sometimes bare ground is really vital for certain wildlife species and is indicative that maybe you don't have as many invasive grasses that sometimes cover up the bare ground. So you have to know your system.
Yeah. So annual grasses definitely be another thing to look at. Might tell you that some things, they need to take a harder look, right?
So Ryan asks, maybe Ryan, you can just ask the question. You had it in the chat.
Hi, Cami. Thanks for the presentation. I was just wondering, when management intensive systems are used well, I guess, properly, and have long recovery periods, does that also tend to have benefits for a lot of wildlife species, like especially ground nesting birds?
Yeah, I would say so, because generally the fields that are being grazed, even though they're being grazed uniformly, they're only a small portion of the ranch. And if the cows are only on that field for a day or 3 days in a management intensive system, the entire rest of the year is dedicated to regrowing and maintaining that forage. So I think we often see a lot of pollinators, we often see a lot of grassland birds, especially the birds that like high cover type stuff. And then in the paddocks that are recently grazed, you'll see the birds that like the lower statured vegetation. Yeah, I guess that kind of answers your question. The general answer is yes. If it's done right, it should improve habitat for most species.
Okay, thanks.
We have time for another question or two if folks want. This is great. This is a really important part of the workshop, getting the feedback and questions from folks that maybe others didn't think of, but wanted to know the answers to anyway. Rick.
Yeah, Cami, another question. And by the way, great presentation. Thanks for that overview. So oftentimes, I know when we work with landowners or even some of the properties that we manage, they're victims of a history of grazing, overgrazing in various forms. And it may well be that the current producer is actually doing a pretty good job. Are there some ways of sort of differentiating what was a past problem and what's more of a current problem?
Yeah, definitely. And that could be a whole PowerPoint on its own. But in that case, the plant communities tell you that it had been overgrazed, but there's indicators of rangeland health and indicators of rangeland trend that can key us in on, even though it's been abused in the past, is it trying to recover? So without going into a lot of details, yeah. There's definitely things you can look at. It's just so site specific, it'd be hard to give you a good answer.
Okay, thank you.
I think that does speak to the point, though, that there is quite a depth to this, and you really need to get to know the landscape you're in. So if you end up, for those students out here, if you end up taking a job somewhere that you're not familiar with, which is really common, and working with private landowners, you really need to study and figure out the different ways the land has responded to different grazing systems through time, and trying to sort out, learn to read the land so that you can figure out how to work with the producer to apply prescriptions that are actually going to get you moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and you guys don't need to try to do it all on your own. I mean, as agencies, we're always partnering on projects and collaborating our knowledge to create on-the-ground results.
Yeah, that's a really, really vital point. You know, if you're new to an area or just new to dealing with grazing systems and grassland management, make sure to make a lot of friends locally who have that history and can coach you through it, because there's a huge amount of knowledge that it's hard to find written down anywhere in a way that makes sense at the local level. Any other questions?
I guess, so I have, I mean, maybe this is, I don't know if this is even answerable, but in this situation where we've been in these like bad droughts for multiple years, do you see that those people who have been able to do a better job with their management over time, are they more resilient? Are they able to keep their numbers up a little bit more than some of the folks who have had to sell cattle off?
Yeah, I think what I see is that the rangeland bounces back the year after a drought much quicker and to a higher extent than people that are stressing their plants from grazing and from drought. So, hopefully this year it starts to rain again. I think you'll see that. I think you'll see pastures, if you're paying attention as you're driving, that just look like they're not growing at all. And that's probably because those plants are dedicating a lot of energy back into their root systems and are just still trying to get going. Whereas under better management, more conservatively stocked places, if those plants are able to maintain their root systems, they'll just pick up and grow a lot quicker than the ones that have really been set back from the drought. So yeah, I think you can see it, and I think the places that maintain a lot of residual cover have sold less cows this year, but the drought's been extremely extreme, so there are not very many cattle left in the country right now.
I'd like to add a thought to that. The other thing that I notice when working with a producer that's really on the front edge of this stuff, not only does the rangeland respond faster, but they respond faster. And oftentimes I see them making decisions well in advance of their peers in the area, which puts them in a better situation. So I think we have two things occurring. We have rangeland that's responding well, but we also have a producer that's responding really well. And they saw the writing in the wall very early, in the past couple of years, and made those decisions to come out of it, to sell at a better time or come out of it better. So
Great point. Well, I'd love to let us continue to chat, but we have to transition now into breakout sessions. And what will happen here pretty quick is that most of you will be transitioned to one of 4 breakout sessions where we'll have a leader walk you through developing a real rudimentary kind of look at a practical application of what CAMI provided to us. And we'll get back together afterwards, take a break, and have someone present what you discussed. And I'd like to ask that the groups pick a presenter other than the leader. Each group has been assigned a leader to really serve as someone to keep things moving in the right direction, not to tell you how to do it. And we will go into that real quick here. You'll get a note to accept a room, and we'll be in there for about 30 minutes. So the breakout, each group will have a scenario that has not been provided to anyone but the leaders. So just to let the leaders know you're possessing that. If you want to share that on your screen, you should be able to do that. I guess any other questions from anyone, breakout leaders, before we start moving over to the breakout rooms? All right, let's start transitioning. See if I can figure out how to do that.